Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. Witkacy, or Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, is on the agenda for today. So let me start by reading a short passage from his late work, Narcotics, translated by Soren Gauger for Twisted Spoon Press. I should point out that peyote prompts neologisms. A friend of mine who speaks like the most normal fellow in the world, during a visionary trance, unable to deal with a strangeness beyond every normal combination of words, once expressed himself as follows: a clompetus symphonate and clodhopper in tri-whirl curtsies. He came up with many such expressions that night, as he lay there beset by hallucinations. I remember only the one. Small wonder, then, that I, who exhibits this tendency even under ordinary circumstances, also had to create at times a word or two to parse and dismember the diabolical whirl of creatures that assailed me all night from the abyss of the peyote netherworld. I see a row of supernaturally huge vaginas with guts and live worms pouring out, and a green embryo as big as a St. Bernard jumps out for the finale, turning somersaults with wild delight. A sea of marvelous beauty lit by a super sun. Some striped beasts frotting together over to the side, looking like colorful sharks, white, black, and orange. I see their cross sections, as if right before my eyes, someone were slicing giant shark cold cuts of indescribable beauty. Ant-eaters spin backward with dizzying speed, echidnas, and among them an incredibly cute rodent, a white-stepped jerboa, covered in fur with forked split ends. Despite the speed of the transformations, I see this with microscopic precision. In the 1980s, when I first became interested in Polish literature, it was the Solidarity era, so of course Poland was on everyone's radar. But I was also interested in avant-gardism and experimental literature, so I was reading writers like Apollinaire and Breton in Paul Auster's bilingual anthology of French modernist literature. I was looking at Paul Celan and Antonin Artaud and the expressionist painter Max Beckmann, and I'd been studying French, and I also started learning German. And then, by a series of coincidences, I was introduced to Witkacy's major novel, Insatiability, translated by Louis Iribarne, and I was astonished by passages like the one above, for their arc of narrative starting in a grounded way and progressing to wild and colorful fantasies. Witkacy writes in Narcotics, "It seems to me that everyone should write with all the intensity they can muster, in both the subtleties and the brutalities." And I thought that this stuff was farther out there than what I'd been reading from the Dadaists and the Surrealists at the time, and I wondered why no one, or at least no one I had yet encountered, seemed to write about Vitkevich and writers of his ilk in English. And that drew me to read more Polish writers like Witold Gombrowicz, Bruno Schulz, Czesław Miłosz, Tadeusz Borowski, Tadeusz Konwicki, Sławomir Mrożek, Wisława Szymborska, and eventually to start learning the Polish language and studying in Poland with a scholarship from the Kościuszko Foundation. And by that time, I was hooked. I was in the field. So today, I'd like to look at some passages like this one and use them as a way into Witkacy's major philosophical concepts. The idea of pure form, as he called it, unity in multiplicity, and what he called, quote, the metaphysical feeling of the strangeness of existence. Before I introduce our guest for the day, I'd like to thank you, our viewers, for making the first episode a success. We had over 500 views in the first 5 days and many more since. And I've had an overwhelming response through social media and email, revealing that there is an interest and genuine need for this kind of discussion of Polish literature among avid readers, students, researchers, and people of all backgrounds. We now have a full schedule of guests eager to present their research and ideas about Polish writers and their works through the end of 2021. And we are beginning to plan sessions for 2022, presuming that we can maintain the support of our audience and can continue to grow. So please, I ask you, hit that subscribe button and show our sponsors at the Polish Cultural Institute, New York, that you are interested and want to see more of what scholars, critics, translators, and eventually authors have to say about Polish literature, its history, and as we move forward, its present. Let me introduce my guest, Professor Benjamin Paloff, scholar, poet, and translator from the University of Michigan. Welcome, Benjamin.
Thank you very much for having me, David. It's really great to talk to you.
Benjamin Paloff is Associate Professor of Slavic Languages and Literatures and of Comparative Literature at the University of Michigan, where he is also affiliated with the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies and the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. Beginning in July of 2021, he will be director of the University Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. His books include Lost in the Shadow of the Word, Space, Time, and Freedom in Interwar Eastern Europe, published by Northwestern University Press in 2016. This book was named the 2018 Best Book in Literary Studies by the American Association of Teachers of Slavic and East European Languages, which has just wrapped up its annual conference. He's published 2 poetry collections, and his orchestra, published in 2015, and The Politics, published in 2011, both from Carnegie Mellon University Press. I should note that it's somewhat unusual for a literary scholar also to be a publishing poet, and that gives our guest a unique perspective on some of what we will be looking at today. His poems have appeared in a wide range of periodicals, including Boston Review, Conduit, New American Writing, The New Republic, the New York Review of Books, and the Paris Review, and he contributes regularly to such magazines as The Nation and the Times Literary Supplement. He has translated about a dozen books and many shorter literary and theoretical texts from Polish, Czech, Russian, and Yiddish, notably works by Dorota Masłowska, Marek Bieńczyk, Richard Weiner, and Yuri Lotman. And he has received grants and fellowships from the Michigan Society of Fellows, the Stanford Humanities Center, and the National Endowment for the Arts, among others. His research focuses on philosophical dilemmas, particularly in metaphysics and the ethics of representation in modern Central and East European literature, as well as on translation theory and practice. He is currently completing a book on the literature of concentration camps, ghettos, and besieged cities. To get into Witkacy, let's think about what's a common issue, I think, for American readers of Slavic literature in general. I mean, I think we've all had the experience before we started studying these things formally of reading a Russian novel and trying to keep track of the names and noticing how there were so many diminutives that the names were constantly changing. So today we're talking about Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, who is known generally as Witkacy. Could you say something about his name and his, what he was doing with his name when he decided to go by Witkacy?
I think we can answer that question in one word: branding. It's difficult to make a life for yourself as an artist with a name like Stanisław Vitkevich when your father's name is also Stanisław Vitkevich, and he, the father, happens to be a major artist and major theoretician of art. His paintings and ideas about visual representation and aesthetics remain, in fact, quite vital today in Poland. He is the father not just of Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, but of the style in architecture known as the Zakopanez style. So if someone were to travel to southern Poland, particularly to the area around Zakopane, this really quite lovely mountain resort, you'll see some buildings in a style of architecture that was pioneered by the father of the writer we are talking about. And this father, Stanisław Vitkevich, was a kind of tyrannical advocate for personal freedom, which sounds like a contradiction, and indeed it is a contradiction. He insisted that his son not receive a formal education, that he should be educated at home, exposed to art, literature, music, philosophy, the folk crafts and the like in southern Poland. and that he would synthesize all of these things spontaneously in producing his own creative self. There's this interesting kind of push-pull throughout Witkacy's life to be both unlike his father and at the same time to live up to his father's demands. So there's this, I mean, it's a challenging relationship. But in defining himself, creating a self in art who is different from his father, he decided, well, I need to figure out first of all, what to do with my name. Because he had the same name as this famous person whose shadow looms large throughout his life. And he created a portmanteau of his last name, Vitkevich, and his middle name, Ignacy, and created Witkacy, which is this estrangement, right? It sounds in Polish, it sounds bizarre in Polish, just about as bizarre in Polish as it does in English, a kind of cartoon character almost. And he was aware of this persona as someone he was kind of adopting at times, so that even later in his life, when he was at times making a living as a portrait artist, he would sign the formal and kind of conventional portraits he did for, you know, local bourgeois families. He would sign them Vitkevich, right? That this was a portrait done by Vitkevich. But for his friends who were artists and writers, etc., he would use various narcotics or in some cases just large amounts of coffee and tobacco, and distort the image as he was producing the portrait, and he would do this for free. And these were the things he would sign Witkacy. So Witkacy is his artistic persona, and it's the name that we most conventionally still know him as.
And he was always putting on personas. I mean, this was, from his youth, he was always acting out parts that made one wonder who was the real Witkacy. He was famous for wearing a white suit, a tropical white suit, and his large brimmed white hat, acting the part of the uncle from California. He took he was an experimenter in photography. He took photographs of himself in different costumes. One of my favorite is a very officious looking costume, as if he looks like the rector of a Polish university, who wears ermine robes and a large gold chain around his neck, and an academic hat that one would only wear in a graduation or something like that. But he's modeling himself as a judge of a rural gingerbread contest, which was exactly the kind of thing that would amuse Vitkevich. So maybe we can think about, like, who really was Vitkevich, and to the extent that it will take a long time to even make an attempt at that. But you mentioned that he was a painter from his learning from his father, but we also know that he wrote plays, he wrote novels. The work that Insatiability, which brought me to an interest in Vitkevich, was a novel. He wrote philosophical treatises of quite a formal nature, and corresponded with professional philosophers. There's a footnote in the work of Roman Ingarden, the Polish phenomenologist, acknowledging that Vitkevich, well, maybe he wasn't too systematic, but his ideas are important, and his impact on culture was important. So what do you see as Vitkevich's main activity? How do you see his main focus?
This is a question that I've been kind of juggling for a while, because in part because there's a convention in Polish literary biography to kind of list all of the spheres of professional activity. So and so, it's very different from the American convention, where in the American convention, if you write a book, you're the author of that book, and that's it. But in Polish, it would, the typical literary biography says so and so was an essayist, a novelist, a playwright, a philosopher, a painter, just listing all of the different kind of professional hats one might wear. And Witkacy wore many of them. He was a photographer, as you mentioned, from a fairly young age. He was experimenting with photography, often putting on kind of theatrical costumes. You mentioned the one this striking image. One of the ones that I really especially like is him as a fairly young man, really as an adolescent, standing in a snowy field with this kind of cape, holding a cat and pointing a pistol as though he's about to fire. And the viewer is really kind of challenged to figure out what the hell is going on in this. And of course, nothing is going on in this. It's all a kind of ploy to force us into the game of making sense of something. But in addition to those kinds of theatrical photographic games that he played, he also experimented with photographic technique, including the use of mirrors, double and triple exposure, slow exposures that blur the image and give you a kind of sense of the melting figure. He was an obsessive self-portraitist, both in photography and then later in painting. He was a prolific playwright over a relatively short period of his life. He did self-published a couple of juvenile plays in his youth, and then one quite significant play in the 30s. But most of his plays, about 24 plays, he wrote in a very short time frame, in about 7 years or so in the 1920s. He wrote 4 rather significant novels. That we still read, which is something. In addition to the philosophical treatises you mentioned, the piece on narcotics that you quoted from at the beginning of the discussion falls into a kind of group of prose texts, longer prose texts that he wrote in the 1930s that is really difficult to place by genre. They're autobiographical, they are sociological, they are extremely digressive. They almost aggressively seek to frustrate our ability to categorize them. So what was he? I would say, frankly, that he was a writer, very simply a writer, and that genre didn't mean much to him. He played with genre in much the way that he played with other art forms. And I would actually, if one were to ask what kind of writer he was, I wouldn't necessarily say novelist or playwright. Obviously, he wrote novels, he wrote plays. I would actually say that he was an experimental writer. And I use that term experimental very carefully. I really despise, honestly, the way that term is abused in sort of journalistic literary criticism, where pretty much anything out of the ordinary is described as experimental. All writers are experimenting all the time. That's what rough drafts are for. What we usually get are the finished products, not the experiments, but the manufacture, the craft. That's not the case with Witkacy. With Witkacy, we get a lot of rough drafts. Because every time he would write something, instead of massaging it and recreating it and shaping it and figuring out exactly what he wanted from it, he would simply jump to the next thing. He would play around with ideas. He would play around with form a great deal. And he was a highly undisciplined writer. He was essentially a graphomaniac, just constantly writing in different genres, different forms for different purposes, often not really knowing what the purpose was for himself. So that even with the destruction, the loss of some of his writings, we know that we're missing a good number of letters, for example. Even with the loss of some of his material during the Second World War, when he committed suicide at the very beginning of the war, we still have collected works for Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz that run about 25 volumes. That's an extraordinary life's output, not including any of the photographs or the paintings or the portraits or these other kind of related ancillary artworks that he played around with.
That's an interesting kind of distinction. I mean, going back to like your own background as as somebody with an MFA and somebody who's a writer and who has that kind of investment in the craft. I've thought about this a lot, in looking at Polish writers, is that it seems that, like, for instance, in Poland, there's a very different idea than there is in the United States generally, not just related to Witkiewicz, about what an editor does. Here, the editor puts his or her stamp on the work, whereas in Poland there are a few people like that, who read with intention and the kind of intensity to help the writer become a better writer, but often the editor is viewed as kind of a copy editor, just cleaning up the manuscript, and it creates an issue for American translators, who then have to say, well, this work hasn't really had an editor. Should I be the editor, or maybe their editor says maybe I should be the editor. So there's this problem of authority. But in going back to Witkacy and thinking about performance and so forth, maybe it's that for Witkacy, writing is a performative act in some sense. I mean, rather than the sculpted text, that maybe it's just another kind of performance. I don't know. What do you think?
I think there's some truth to that. I mean, I think what you say, of course, about the conventions of Polish publishing and Polish literary culture, the culture that produces literary texts, which is really a question or a whole topic that's largely neglected in literary studies, the sociology of literary production. Because these things do change over time, and they certainly differ across cultures. I used to joke, and it is not entirely fair to my friends and colleagues who are professional writers in Poland and who are fantastically gifted and dedicated to their craft. But I used to joke that in Poland you can write a book on a cocktail napkin and have it bound and printed in a beautiful edition within a few weeks. And by the same token, the same friends and colleagues in Poland used to question, why is it that a poet in the United States is considered a young poet at the age of 38? Well, it's because there's this kind of slow movement into print in Anglo-American print culture, and there is a very fast movement into print in Poland. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is that in the United States or in England, when a book is published, it remains more or less available in perpetuity. You can almost always find, if it's not in print, you can find print on demand, and if you can't find print on demand, you can find used copies quite easily. It remains in circulation. In Poland, once a book is published, it's available for 6 to 18 months, and then it disappears, and you'll never see it again. So there's a sense almost of the disposability of text in Polish print culture, and that's not just a modern phenomenon. That goes back well over a century, and certainly in Witkacy's time, that he could write something, it would be published quite readily. Not all of his works were published quite readily, but a great many of his work was published. Or he could write a play, and within weeks or months, it might be staged. This kind of like constant appetite for fresh new material, which is another frustration for the translators as observers of Polish literature in contemporary print. We have to wade through a lot of stuff. The gate is much more wide open than the other direction would have it. So we have this 25, like I said, about 25 volumes of Witkacy's collected works. They're not all going to be winners, right? There's this, again, this kind of disposability of the text, which for Witkacy actually serves his artistic project very well, because he is constantly deferring, he's constantly digressing. Instead of explaining to us or helping to us to understand what's going on in one play, he just writes another play that's just as perplexing. There is not a sense uh, of 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 public engagement so much as a persistent sense, almost an adolescent sense of public offense.
Hmm.
And that again fits into the ethos of the avant-garde in that part of Europe in that period. Remember that the famous uh, uh, Russian futurist manifesto authored by Mayakovsky and others is called a slap in the face of public taste. Right? There's this desire to offend people's expectations, and one of the reasons I think that Witkacy is always deferring and always digressing and moving from one thing to the next very quickly is that he doesn't want people to figure him out. Um, and in that sense, I kind of think that uh, the art of Witkacy is not any one particular text; it's the whole package, which you can access through different ways. I think that Insatiability, the novel that you mentioned, is perhaps the most fruitful entry point. But you can get into him in any number of ways, and kind of find yourself being thrown about from one play to the next or into a theoretical text. Often these things are actually woven into the texts themselves. He'll have long philosophical digressions in his plays that then refer you to other things he's written, and not just by comparison or analogy. He will literally refer you in the play to other things he has written.
One reading that I think some of us have of why he moved from one medium to another was that a sense of dissatisfaction in the search for what he called pure form, czysta forma in Polish. He was striving for pure form in painting and felt he wasn't achieving it. And then he tried for pure form in the theater and felt that he couldn't achieve it there, and that maybe he could at best represent other people experiencing pure form in his novels, and then he could describe it philosophically, in his philosophical writing. So maybe if you could maybe connect, help connect this, his philosophical ideas and his maybe insatiability and maybe something in one of his plays. What do you see as pure form for Witkacy?
This is one of the more contentious concepts in Eastern and Central European literature in the 20th century. It's a sticky or slippery, I should probably is a better term, a slippery concept that he is constantly explaining, re-explaining, redefining, and very often trying to connect it to other philosophical writings and debates that he is engaged in at any given moment, which only, in a sense, pollutes the notion, because pure form is this in at one moment, and then a couple of years later it's this sort of other thing. But what it boils down to is a dream of artistic representation that would represent nothing, that would be entirely just the form of the artistic product without any of its content. It would not represent anything outside of the artistic product itself. And at times, you're right, he thinks that, well, maybe the place for this is in the theater. And you could almost imagine that pure form in its most radical distillation would be a stage in which just random shapes and colors appear with disconnected music. And he never really quite got to that level of avant-garde playwriting. He actually, one of the challenges that he faced in producing pure form in the theater, even though he wrote about it philosophically, is that he still wrote plays more or less according to the conventions of stagecraft of his time. They have a dramatis personae, they have a setting, they have a dialogue, they have stage directions. He never really quite breaks out of those conventions, which inevitably means that no matter how random the action on stage may appear to be, the audience will associate it with something. It will represent something to someone. And in fact, very often he will the play's actions will disintegrate into these kind of long philosophical arguments, representing clear-cut ideological or philosophical or political positions. So pure form is not really happening as such, but the closest he could get was through a kind of randomness and digression, or through the transformation of the usually male hero into something completely different from what he had appeared to be at the very beginning of the play. He also thought that pure form might exist in painting. He was especially inspired by the revolution in painting that is best represented by Picasso and Cubism. Non-representational art, visual art, fascinated him. He claimed that pure form could not exist in prose fiction, because he said prose fiction is a very simple form that inevitably has representational content. And yet, paradoxically, in the 1930s, when he reconnects with a friend, Bruno Schulz, and reads what Schulz has been writing, he thinks, aha, this might be it. The perfect marriage of form and content, where the content disappears behind the form. He would claim that Insatiability is not really a representation of pure form, and arguably these later works that we alluded to, where he is writing about, for example, his experiments with narcotics, but folding in philosophical ruminations and autobiography and sociology and just random digressions, that these things that disrupt our sense of genre are also gesturing in the direction of pure form. But what is the question we might ask is, what's the point? What's the point of having art that represents nothing, where there has no content? And some important writers of the era actually thought, well, so this is just it really is an altogether empty concept. For example, Alexander Vaught, and I think you're going to have a segment on Vaught in a later episode, but he wrote a short kind of and somewhat dismissive review of Witkacy's aesthetic sketches from the early 1920s, and said that pure form equals non-signification, which is what we said. It's non-representational art, but it equals nothing. It's art that says nothing, that does nothing. But if we are a little more generous and are asking Witkacy what he thinks pure form does, he believes that the effort that we make as individuals to piece together the parts of any kind of random array, this kind of random action, understanding why it is that this character who had no reason to kill themselves just killed themselves on stage, and then takes a different form later on. All this randomness, what's the point of it? Witkacy thinks that individually in the audience, we see the different elements and make connections between them that fill us with a sense of metaphysical wonder, a sense of all things being ultimately connected behind the appearance of their discrete disunities, right? He thinks that multiplicity is really in some ways simply an illusion. And that we as individuals, yes, we are individual, but we're also all deeply connected, and not just with each other, but with things. And that kind of unity within multiplicity exists on the most minute scale, on the atomic scale, in fact, on the monadic scale. And he writes in some of his philosophical work about monadology, which is an idea that goes back to Leibniz. It's a German philosophical idea, a kind of proto atomic theory. We're all made of the same stuff, and we lose track of that. We lose track of the wonder of that interconnection, because we have I have a table as a table and a chair as a chair, and they're already defined for their use in much the same way as people are already defined for their use. But Witkacy believes that all things are subject to permanent transformations. I mean, not permanent in the sense that they will transform into something and become essentially that thing, but that things are constantly in a state of flux and revolution, and that art is supposed to wake us up. Um, there's a link that we can make here, in fact, to the um, Russian formalist concept articulated famously by Viktor Shklovsky of остранение, the estrangement. The purpose of art is to wake us up to the strangeness of the things around us, and not just in the sense of, well, I can do this with fantasy or science fiction or being weird. Witkacy was all about being weird, but Shklovsky's great example is how a writer describes the leg of a table, and describes it in such fine detail with such texture that you become aware of the common object in a way that you had lost track of. Well, Witkacy's art is also largely about this whole idea of pure form is a kind of overt, almost violent estrangement to shock you out of your sense of propriety, normalcy, expectation, meaning, all of it, so that you become aware of something that's behind all of those things.
It's almost as if he's having this debate, it seems, with the other major tendency which is happening in Eastern Europe in the 30s, namely in Russia, which is socialist realism. That on the one hand, there's this idea that everything has to express a kind of social utility, and he's asking, what is the ultimate utility? It's like in Wallace Stevens' poem "The Snowman," right? That ends, that he's the man who can see nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. So when Vaught says that there's nothing there, well, does he really mean? Maybe Vaught really means that there's nothing there, that it's not interesting. But maybe Witkacy would respond, yes. There's nothing there. There's the nothing there. That's the kind of interesting nothing. It's like an idea of the Kantian sublime. I mean, and there's a passage in Insatiability, one of those ones that I was inspired by, where he describes he's walking out. And he's looking at the stars, and if you can imagine being in Zakopanez, far away from any major cities, especially in the 20s and 30s, you can see all kinds of things in the sky that maybe most of us who live too close to urban areas don't get to see. And he says, as he's looking up at the stars, Genezip, the main character of Insatiability, says, above and below had lost all meaning for him. He was suspended in an abyss, terrifying, amorphous, undifferentiated. For a second he had comprehended the infinity of space. It had been, and lasted during the very moment he experienced it. Eternity was as nothing compared to the monstrous infinitude of time within infinite space and the heavenly bodies inhabiting it. What to make of the thing? It was beyond imagining, and yet impressed itself on the mind with absolute ontological necessity. The same mystery had shown him its unmasked face, but in a different way. The immense world, and himself metaphysically alone, he would require companionship without the possibility of cognition. What were ideas before the horror of the immediately given? Still, there was something painfully sweet in this sensation of loneliness. At the moment, he felt quite small in the infinite tangle of the universe, not small in relation to the vast expanses of this nocturnal sky, but in his deepest feelings toward his mother and the princess, the love object at this point of the novel. That's very much like this, this idea of awe or wonder that Kant talks about, for instance. I don't know if it's exactly the same, because he's aware of psychology. He's aware of Freud. He has too much else going on to sort of have that kind of Kantian idea in its pure sense, but at the same time, I mean, it's not there are kind of connections to other ideas, that are behind pure form, unity, and multiplicity, and things like that.
Oh, for sure. And but at the same time, and the thing is, he's a very contradictory writer, right? And that's part of what generates the vastness of all of this material, is that he advances ideas and he kind of retreats from them. You and I, in fact, had been speaking earlier at a different time. I think you and I, David, have had this kind of conversation about Witkacy going on for well over a decade. I think closer to two. And you have brought up the comparison to Dostoevsky's Underground Man, and the Underground Man is this classic figure of impulse and revulsion. Right, he takes a step forward, he takes a step back. He wants to assert his lowliness, and then he wants to assert his highness. He wants to redeem a prostitute, and then he decides to cast her back down. He has good impulses that are met with bad impulses, et cetera, et cetera. And Witkacy is like this in a sense as well. He is describing in this passage from Insatiability this this sense that the unity of things, the totality of things, is beyond the grasp of the mind. It is unimaginable. And at the same time, he was staunchly opposed to the idea that these unities could be intuited. He was really quite a staunch opponent of Henri Bergson, for example, who was the major kind of literary philosopher of his era, and against Bergson, Witkacy insists that no, we can piece this together. We can actually articulate this through logic. And yet the theme of something ultimately being unimaginable, he comes back to again and again. And there's a passage actually from his book Concepts and Theorems Implied by the Concept of Existence, which is one of his more technical it attempts to be a more technical philosophical work. Of course, it disintegrates in its arguments in Witkacy-like fashion. But he says in that book, inasmuch as we have had to accept that existence is a multiplicity and is unimaginable as a singularity, so too must the form of existence be one and singular, as an encompassing totality of existence. To the question of whether this form exists as a singularity, we may respond that it is itself, as something that exists in the sense we have ascribed to the concept of existing, and speaking of existence in general, unthinkable. It exists together with existence. And just as existence is unimaginable without this form, so too is the form unimaginable without existence. And in a sense, one could argue that pure form in an artistic product is a mirror, or at least a keyhole, perhaps would be a better metaphor, a keyhole into existence as such, something that gives you a flash of that metaphysical feeling, that which he always describes as a feeling, not as a thought, not as something you imagine, not as something you picture, because all of those things inevitably refer to something else, but just as a feeling that would allow you to see, it's all one thing. And that there's something actually quite special in that, and quite moving, because he often describes that desire for that feeling, that need for not to make sense, not to calculate reality, but that need to feel that there is something behind the world that we're kind of looking at. He describes this often in painful terms, as something that as a kind of lust or desire that is difficult to pacify. And in the novel Insatiability, there is this idea, a kind of science fiction figure that is perhaps Witkacy's most enduring thought. And it's the idea of a pill, a drug that would encapsulate uh, uh, a perhaps Zen philosophy of non-being that would completely pacify you. And you take this pill and you become one with nothingness. You discover a kind of, or you encounter a kind of nirvana, and that this will dampen your constant need for metaphysical satisfaction, for metaphysical feeling. And the way that this idea actually becomes really quite current long after, or well after, Witkacy's death is in Czesław Miłosz's The Captive Mind. The pill in the novel is called the pill of Murty being, and this is the first chapter of The Captive Mind, where Miłosz is trying to explain to a Western audience. He writes this in France, and this then is published in English. He's trying to explain to a Western audience the effects of totalitarianism on the creative imagination. And one of the best ways he can come up with to explain this is by taking Witkacy's idea from the novel and saying, it's like the ideology is like the pill of Murty being. It flattens out your brain waves. You don't see contradiction, you don't see difference, you just see the unity of all things. Whereas for Miłosz, as also for Witkacy, you need to have conflict in order to create.
That's an interesting way that that Miłosz uses Witkacy's idea in his argument with literature of utility, literature of his opposition to that. I mean, in we were talking recently about his play The Shoemakers, which is almost a kind of socialist realist play. It came out in the same year as Dziga Vertov's film, Three Songs of Lennon. And it's interesting that he called the subtitle of the play of The Shoemakers is Three Little Songs. And I tracked down the dates. He couldn't have seen the film before he wrote the play, but he probably knew about it. He probably had read about this film that was in process. And there's no other good reason for him to have called The Shoemakers Three Little Songs. But it's an obvious parody of the idea of the workers' paradise, that there are three shoemakers and they're in prison, and one is saying, work, 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 give us some work, we want work, we want to do something socially useful, and they're in prison and they're under prosecution. The prosecutor is given this absurd name, Skurvy, which looks like scurvy, because he was interested in things English, and he made fun of them. But of course, in Polish, this sounds terribly vulgar. So in good productions of the play, the actors will extend this name as long as possible to emphasize this double meaning, and it's at that time to write in the late 20s, 30s, something so directly opposed to this this idea of literature of utility, or that makes it absurd that that workers just want to do more and more work to contribute to society, is visionary, and to look back at it, for Kant, the idea of the sublime in the infinite is that it reveals the infinite potential of the mind, right? That we can comprehend the idea of the infinite because we have this infinity within us. But it's interesting that what you say to describe it as a feeling, rather than something you can come to by reason. Maybe it was also a feeling for Kant. Kant is using reason to figure out what it is, but then can he describe it as it is, as such? in itself, maybe not. I mean, maybe for both of them, it's a kind of a feeling, but Kant doesn't have the words for a feeling yet, in that way that we do in the 20th century.
The problem for Kant is perhaps has to do with these two. I mean, they're separated by time and tradition, but Kant has um, a very specific relationship to experience. And for Witkacy, the key thing is that you can understand the totality of existence through a kind of logical intellect, but you can't experience it. You can only experience it spontaneously in these moments of artistic, almost ecstasy. This moment of feeling that is triggered by an artistic engagement. And in this respect, we could at least venture to propose that Kant and Witkacy are quite far apart from each other, because aesthetic experience for Kant is through one's disinterest, right? Is through the lack, is through a permanent separation from the object. Whereas for Witkacy, there's this moment where you're spontaneously absorbed into the object, and you no longer recognize the difference between the art and yourself. And it's just a flash. It's just an instant. It's just a moment. But it's also, at the same time, it's not the same as intuition, because intuition would be this kind of intellectual processing of it. He thinks of those two things as separate. You can write about metaphysical feeling, but that's not the same as experiencing it. To experience it, you can't possibly be writing about it. It has to be precognitive. And one of the things that then he then becomes especially frightened by in his later life, in the last decade or so of his life, is the march of ideology, the programmatic thinking that forces individuals to live or experience a certain way. So that in The Shoemakers, in most respects his most conventional play, also his last play, he is really not even attempting pure form. He makes fun of it in the play. He is making an argument. And in other writings from that same period, what we get is insistently the fear of authoritarian or totalitarian control of the mind. This is what we get already in Insatiability, which he writes, he publishes, I think, 1930, and then his last novel, which he never finished, the Only Way Out. It really is this dystopian, this very dark dystopian vision of totalitarian powers marching across Europe and the world. In fact, Czesław Miłosz, who was at that point in the 30s still a young man, in his 20s, and beginning his life as a poet, was very much a poet of the so-called catastrophist school. Poets who were writing in imaginative anticipation of the developments in the political developments in Europe taking a very dark turn, which of course they in fact did. But Miłosz himself years later, describes Witkacy as the godfather of catastrophism, the person who really helped young writers of that era, who were, of course, much younger by a quarter of a century, younger than Witkacy. They looked up to him and they saw, he gets it. He sees that this is not just about military or imperial control. It's about control of the mind.
I'm thinking now about Witkacy's legacy, since it's so interesting that he was so enormously influential in Poland. I mean, if we think about, Gombrowicz was, borrowing his most, famous neologisms, upupienie, right? The infantilization, but literally meaning, something like tushification. It's this
Yeah,
childish word
tushification, exactly.
that's a major theme in Gombrowicz. It came from Insatiability, if I'm not mistaken. Schulz visited Witkacy. He perhaps Witkacy was part of his inspiration to experiment, as well as serving an important institutional role in helping him to become more well known as a writer. Tadeusz Kantor, the great artist and producer of theater, started by putting on Witkewicz's plays underground during the war, and it became, Witkewicz's aesthetic became, part of everything that he did. And and contemporary writers. I mean, I think who are experimental, if you'll allow me to use that word, or who try to do different things than, say, conventional, say, realism, or like the writer who you yourself have translated, Dorota Masłowska, seems could she exist in the way that she did? Could she have written the book that you translated as what's the English title again? Russian Red and
Snow White and Russian Red. Although I can't claim credit for that. That was actually the title. It was Schneeweiß und Rußrot in the German translation, and the American publishers could not figure out what they wanted. I actually wanted a very literal, the literal translation of Masłowska's first novel would be the Polish-Ruski War under a white and red flag. And I really wanted the extravagance of that, the linguistic extravagance of that, to be the title. And of course, it frightens editors, so much so that in fact the English translation appears under two different titles in the United States and in the UK, even though it's the same translation in the book, because the editors just couldn't really agree on what it should sound like. But that extravagance in language really owes a lot to Witkacy.
It's probably the marketing department that couldn't.
Almost
couldn't
certainly.
tolerate it.
Almost certainly. In fact, I vaguely recall that was part of the explanation: is how do you market a book with a title like that? But as we said, in the Polish context, both now and then, the marketing wasn't so much an issue, because the book will be printed, it will sell out, and it'll disappear, and then it's the next thing after that. This constant need to invent, the constant need to produce, is something that we still see in Polish publishing. So it's not, when I call Witkacy a graphomaniac, he's not alone. It's just that he's, if one might say in Polish, aż nadto. He's writing constantly, and he's constantly inventive. He's always inventing some new way of saying something, and really constantly trying to offend people's expectations. And I don't mean just frustrate their expectations, but offend their expectations.
That's a good note to end our discussion of Witkacy on, because we've been talking about this for 20 years, and we could talk about this for another 20 years, I am sure. We have some students watching who might be interested in studying Polish literature formally, or studying Polish studies. Could you say a little bit about your program at the University of Michigan?
I have really an enormous privilege to work with a phenomenal group of colleagues, specialists in Central and Eastern Europe at the University of Michigan. I work obviously in Polish studies, but I really consider myself to be a comparatist. That kind of interdisciplinary work that I do is something that is a key component of the intellectual life at the University of Michigan. At the same time, as we're one of very few institutions outside of Poland that is equipped to offer Polish not just as a course of study a program, but it's both an undergraduate and a graduate major. We have undergraduates who major in Polish literature and culture, and we have graduate students who write their doctorates in our Slavic department exclusively on Polish literature and culture, or sometimes in combination with Russian or Ukrainian or German or other fields, Jewish studies. And at the same time, the University of Michigan is home to the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies, which is a significant research center that brings together faculty who work in Polish and related fields from all different parts of the university: history, anthropology, political science, sociology, film, art, and in fact also American studies. So that it's one of these few places one can be where there is not just a critical mass for the study of Poland and Polish culture, Polish history, Polish language, where we teach Polish from the ground floor all the way up through the advanced language, but also to study Poland in its relation to the world, to its neighbors, to global phenomena. It's really quite a special place. So if the study of Poland and its role in the world is something that interests students, the University of Michigan is worth a very serious look.
It certainly is. So I want to thank you. Thanks for appearing on our series. And I want to, we have to thank many other people who make this all possible. Above all, the Polish Cultural Institute New York that sponsors the series, and its director, Robert Czaniawski, Bartek Remisko, who is in charge of humanities and literature programming at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, who suggested this series and acts as our executive producer, our wonderful editor, Natalia Iudin, and fellow producer who handles all of the technical and aesthetic aspects of this production and makes us look good in the end. And Claudia Ofłona Draber, who is also at the Polish Cultural Institute New York and handles our communications and publicity for the series. I'd like to thank you all for listening and for reading along with us. And look forward to when we can meet again in a month, when we'll be discussing the work of Witold Gombrowicz with my good friend and colleague Bożena Szalkros, who teaches at the University of Chicago. So see you all in a month, and thank you for being with us.